Now we are going to listen to our international speaker, Sarah Wyatt, and she's a human rights advisor, consultant, and also a member of the International Arts Rights Advisors Association. She's also the former director at PEN International. And recently she wrote a report for the Council of Europe about more informal influencing of politics into the arts. So I think when the human rights are violent, then we all know that we are against it, of course. But there is certainly in Europe this kind of more informal influencing, and that will be the topic of her lecture. Thank you.
Okay, I have a PowerPoint slide, but hopefully I just won't go through those bullet points in a boring way. As Annika said, I am the author of a report commissioned by the Council of Europe on freedom of artistic expression. And I was really glad to hear Lara's speech, because we tend to see freedom of artistic expression being mainly about somewhere that happens outside Europe first. And secondly, it's about imprisonment and law cases. But what has been notable to me in my work on artistic freedom, when I moved from general human rights and media freedom to artistic freedom, it's those under the radar, what we refer to as under the radar impacts that Lara had been talking and pressures, which come out in different ways than the obvious. Now I'll just run through the contents of the report. I think it's better to describe this as freedom of artistic expression. And interesting, as Lara said, it's it's a concept that can be quite confusing and difficult to categorize. But artistic freedom can be understood as described by UNESCO, as the freedom to imagine, create, distribute diverse cultural expressions free of government censorship, political interference, or the pressures of non-state actors. Now, this report is available on the Council of Europe website, but where's this thing? Just to explain the Council of Europe work on artistic freedom, you have the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 10 of which specifically protects the right to freedom of expression. It doesn't say artistic freedom, but it's artistic freedom is encompassed by freedom of expression. You've got the European Court on Human Rights. Now, that has overseen many, many cases on media rights, but it has also adjudicated on a number of artistic freedom cases in recent years, and there are a couple of those referred to in the report. 2-3 years ago, the Council of Europe developed its manifesto on freedom of expression on arts and culture in the digital age, underlining the importance of artistic freedom. It's also got a very interesting free to create, create to be free program. I think it's the only human rights body that actually puts the art itself, right at the front. And it's a rolling program where member states of the Council of Europe put forward works by their own artists from their own countries, interpreting what they mean by artistic freedom. And again, it's very worthwhile looking at it. It's got a very broad view because it includes countries such as Poland and Azerbaijan, who I think have a quite different interpretation of what is artistic freedom. But it's also part of a program that right from the start of the Council of Europe, it saw art and culture as incredibly important for peace within Europe. And it had a series of exhibitions over the years. Some of them were more general or specific to things like Michelangelo, but also they had others with more topics related to freedom and human rights, such as the 2012-2015 exhibition, Desire for Freedom, Art in Europe since 1945. And the program we have on now is actually developed from that exhibition. Now, I'm missing a very important slide here. It's the international conventions that protect artistic freedom. I mentioned Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights. There's also Article 19 of the UN International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which says that everyone has the right to hold opinions without interference. Everyone shall have the right to freedom of expression, including the right to seek, receive, and impart information, regardless of frontiers, and importantly for us, in any form, including the arts. But, and this is what is of interest in this discussion, it also has restrictions. The restrictions relate broadly to the rights and reputations of others. That could be very broadly interpreted. And also for the protection of national security or public order, or for public health and morals. So even within what is seen to be quite a rigid mechanism, there is real area for interpretation. And I should also add that the European Convention on Human Rights also had similar restrictions on relating to duties and responsibilities of the artists or of people to around the areas of rights and reputations, etc. So they're not absolute rights. Oops, I'm pressing the wrong key. Oops, back in. Definitions of artistic freedom. Now, work that I've been doing with UNESCO for its 2005 Convention on the Protection and Promotion of the Diversity of Cultures defines artistic freedom as the right to create without censorship or intimidation, of course. But it's also the right to have your work supported, distributed, and remunerated. It's all very well just making your art in a corner, but you should have the opportunity to be able to put it out there. The right to freedom of movement, to be able to practice your work across borders. The right to freedom of association, to be able to take collective action on behalf of yourself. It's also the right to protection of social and economic rights. If you don't have access to, if you're not being paid, if you're not on a very low wage, then therefore you're going to be paying less into the tax system, therefore you will have less access to your to social welfare. And more broadly, the right to participate in cultural life. That's for everybody, not just for the artists. Okay. As I mentioned, we tend to see artistic freedom as something that happens elsewhere. And it's true, there are horrible instances, mass arrests in countries like Russia, in Iran, and Afghanistan. We know those stories. Now, another organisation that I'm very pleased to be associated with is FreeMuse, which is the only organisation that is monitoring artistic freedom across the world and provides data on where this is happening, what kinds of attacks are happening, and who is doing it. Its last report on Europe reported 402 attacks in 28 countries in Europe, and it represented 32% of all reported attacks globally. And this is everything from being imprisoned, from being attacked in the street, from having your work censored, and all right across the spectrum. Now, I think, like most of you here, we're a little bit suspicious when we see a percentage, 32%. That's also probably reflective of the fact that we do have relative freedom of expression here, so you can report on what's happening. But it's still a significant figure. And I suspect that that 402 is very low. When I've spoken to Polish artists, for instance, I find out that there have been many, many more cases than have been reported to me in the English-speaking press, because, of course, I'm only speaking in English. And so it's only just the tip of the iceberg. Now, the broad threats to artistic freedom. There is the use of anti-terror legislation. And I suppose I, like for most people, am not against legislation that protects me and others from terrorism. I'm not against anti-terror legislation as such, but it's the interpretation. What is anti-terror? Who is a terrorist? that becomes problematic. So, for instance, in Turkey, many artists and writers have been detained under anti-terror laws because of their criticism of the government, or more so, simply because of standing up for Kurdish rights. So they're seen to be associated with terror. When we've had crises like, I don't know, a big terrorist attack in Europe, there tends to be a knee-jerk reaction. I believe even in Belgium, though, at the time of attacks, that there were films which were to be shown on film festivals were withdrawn for fear that they might upset the community. In Britain, we had a woman who used toys dressed up as jihadists, who found her work taken down. So it's the interpretation that's the problem. You've got people who mock the powermongers, insult laws, defamation laws. Now, again, I have no problem with an individual person who is truly being defamed, whose life is being made terrible, who may lose work because of lies and defamation. But, and this has also been recognised in the European Court of Human Rights, if you put yourself in a position of power, you need to accept criticism. And also you've got the machinery of the state and the media to stand up for yourself. It is not correct to turn to defamation laws. It's certainly not correct to imprison people because of their criticism. And I think artists are particularly susceptible because the use of satire, as we've also heard from Lara, is very much central to art of all sorts. Laws on blasphemy and insult to religion. Again, insult to religion, can you insult a religion? I mean, that's questionable. It's all up to interpretation. Some beliefs are protected above others. And in fact, insult to religion laws, blasphemy laws are not the appropriate laws to be using. We have hate speech laws to protect people from the very nasty commentary, very hurtful, very damaging. Blasphemy laws are just too vague and too problematic for use in those situations. Oops. Oh, let's go back a piece. Of course, we've got violence and intimidation by non-government groups. In many countries in Europe, these are very well handled by the police. But in other countries, these groups can act with impunity, that they can act as agents of government, or by reverse, through their actions, whether it's in person or whether it's on social media, can influence decisions by government. They think, oh, this is a public opinion that we need to listen to, when in fact, they're just a small, vociferous group. We have the vulnerable groups, of course, women, LGBT and other minorities who can be particularly targeted but may not have the same platform to be able to stand up for themselves. And then there's the whole world of online dangers, which, to be honest, is such a big issue that I don't touch on it in great detail in the report. Oh, here's just some example of the anti-terror laws being used in Turkey to penalise works by Molière and other classics. These are called works promoting terrorism because they are being performed in Kurdish. Just one of the ridiculous cases that we have. But it's not just in Turkey. We have in countries like Spain, where I think we have one case of a person who, as you probably know, from a rapper from Spain, who's actually got political exile, I think in Belgium or the Netherlands?
In Brussels.
In Brussels, because he was accused of terrorism, support of terrorism, and insulting the monarchy. It's crazy. There we have the case. There have been a number of other rappers who've been similarly charged. Luckily, haven't had to leave their country. You've also had the famous case of Jan Böhmermann in Germany. Now, this is the case where it wasn't even a person within the country that took the case. It was President Erdogan who ordered the German court, because there was a law in Germany that hadn't been used for decades, but they could dig it out and find it. And there are a lot of other countries in Europe where insulting another head of state could theoretically bring you before the courts. Now, as a result of this case, the German government changed its law, and as did a number of others. But there are many countries, and I list them down here, and still in Germany in some cases, where insulting a politician, insulting a leader, insulting a king or a queen could theoretically bring you to court. The fact that it's not used necessarily that much doesn't mean to say that we shouldn't do some work to clear out these laws, some of them going back to the 19th century. And again, insult and satire tends to affect artists more than they do in other cases. Blasphemy law. I take the case of the Stitching play, which was performed in Malta, the case in Malta. It's a play actually by a British playwright, Andrew Neilson, and he's part of a group of artists who use really unsettling, extreme imagery to drive their message home. So you may know of Sarah Kane and her works. You might know, of course, of Irvine Welsh. They really do push the boundaries in order to get their message across. In 2008, the performance of this play was banned in Malta. Accusations of obscene content, of blasphemy, reference to the Holocaust, etc. Now, what is interesting about this is this case was taken to the European Court on Human Rights, which ruled in favour of the playwright. They say that the banning order should be lifted. But that took 10 years. That's very typical for the European Court on Human Rights. If you want to take your case, be prepared for a long run. But just 2 years before that, the Maltese government actually abolished blasphemy as a crime, which is really interesting because just a year before that, there had been around about 90 prosecutions in 1 year of blasphemy. I have to admit, I don't quite understand why the sudden change of heart. But was there a big rise in artists and others doing blasphemous works? Apparently not. The same goes for Greece, which also had pretty horrendous attacks on artists in recent years. They suddenly removed their blasphemy laws. Has there been a big rise in blasphemous content? I don't think so. Ireland is another case. So when you get governments taking actions, legal actions, giving money, withdrawing money in the public interest, you have to ask, who is that public? Who are you talking about here? So it seems, I would say, and I might be wrong, that in the case of blasphemy, of course, there are people who are upset by these works, but not to the extent that they want to see a law that would imprison others. I talked earlier about under-the-radar impacts, and I think Lara covered quite a lot of this. The report then, when I mean by above the radar, these are ones that are relatively easy to report because people going into courtrooms or being attacked or even killed, sadly, are things that tend to go into the media. Under the radar is much more difficult to evaluate. We talk about undue government intervention. This can be maybe representation, political representation on museum boards. Funding that is linked to political agendas as to rather than into what maybe the museum or the institution wishes to see. Influence on public broadcasting, which also can lead to institutional self-censorship. And of course, this isn't just government funding, it's also other sponsors as well. It does bring it back to the question, though, if you're being funded by the state, by taxpayers' money, well, surely we should be taking the public interest into account. Part of my report was based on just a closed discussion with a number of artists, and many of those were from countries which weren't the usual suspects. We did have people from Poland, Hungary, and Turkey, but we had people from Belgium, Norway, and other countries from democracies. And the question really came, if you are being funded, of course, artists are so reliant on government funding from sponsorship, it becomes a key issue. That the money is being done for the public. The money is being provided for public interest, but who are these ones? You've of course got the issue of underrepresented groups, How do they find a voice? Are some underrepresented groups favoured above others? In traditional communities, I mean, this is maybe a difficult question, is it right for government to, for instance, highlight LGBT? You will support work on LGBT, but not necessarily on the other aspects of your work. Highly contentious issues. In fact, there was an interesting report carried out in Sweden by the Culture Analysis Institute, which concluded that Swedish cultural funding was inadvertently suppressing artistic freedom. It was, as they put it, funding was increasingly policy-driven, favouring projects that fit government priorities above artistic merit. Now, that's a very vague issue again, and again, Lara was talking just about that as well. Also, that it's just not the requirements were not clearly framed, and sometimes really clumsily framed. And it's interesting that the Swedish culture minister took that report and acknowledged the problems and said, of course we want to promote diversity, of course we want to do that, nobody's arguing that. But the process itself was restricting artists. And in fact, importantly, as the artists in the study that I carried out, importantly, the artists from those diverse communities were also felt excluded simply by the complications and the demands that the hoops that they had to jump through in order to achieve that support. So that's where we have this comment that funders are inadvertent censors. They think they're helping, but at times they're actually restricting. I took my time. Oops. Here are just some quotes from the meeting itself in the artists. I do theatre to push the envelope. We are pushing. They're wanting to see artistic freedom, to be in a society was not only okay, but is wanted. That public money is used as an excuse for funding something or someone, and this instrumentalizes the public. Again, that discussion. I'm quite surprised that the Council of Europe allowed me to swear, although I did use asterisk. This was a Hungarian artist. The idea of art not having any value, like it's just for fun, is so fucking absurd. And also, and I get this feeling of many years in human rights, the work of being constantly vigilant, fighting for one's rights and values and so on, is exhausting, draining, and even boring. And that's particularly so if you're in a precarious profession such as the arts, where you're already struggling just to earn an income, and on top of it to be fighting for your rights as well. Draining and boring, yeah. Whoops, keep putting it back, sorry about that. Nope. Oh. Working with the Council of Europe, working as a human rights advocate is always, well, so what? We know all about this, so what can we do now? We should demand that states stand by their obligation to protect artistic freedom. And I'd go further and to say to have more discussions and better understanding within the states and the institutions. International and regional organisations should include artists when promoting freedom of expression. Now, there is a new, quote, well, not so new, quote, mechanism as a special rapporteur on culture who does great work reporting on and exploring all aspects of not just freedom of artistic expression, but other areas relating to the cultural field. The current person is Professor Alexandra Zantaki, who's really interesting, and she has a very specific interest in migrants' rights as well. I found in my many years working with civil society and human rights organisations, they tended to see artists as something other, something silly. Yeah, they hadn't until recently included them in their activities and advocacy, and I often think they don't really understand the cultural sector anyway. So you often get a kind of a bit of a problematic relationship there. But a number of them are taking up artistic freedom more recently. Artists and cultural institutes, well, they're already struggling with resources. And I find that they just don't have the resources but should be given more resources and support to monitor attacks in their own countries. As I mentioned earlier about Poland, if I had only been relying on the information that I got from the English-speaking press, I wouldn't have known about the many, many other cases that happened in just 1 year in Poland. So we're working with Freemuse, Council of Europe and others to support organisations within their countries to monitor and report and advocate. And artists are actually, to me, the most important. They are the ones that should be encouraged and helped to create networks and exchange. I myself, as first and foremost a human rights activist, have learned so much just from talking to the artists themselves about those subtle ways that they feel repressed, about those questions which I hadn't thought or hadn't heard within the human rights community. So we, again, the Freemuse, Council of Europe, are bringing together small groups of artists to have informal discussions to really get to the heart of what the issues are. I would add that many of those issues are so complex that they're not necessarily those that can be resolved by having, I don't know, another manifesto or another statement from the UN or whatever, but to keep talking about the problem, because those problems keep changing. Yeah. But for all of us also to work to create a better public understanding of the importance of artistic freedom. Again, the public, as you know better than I do, tend to see the cultural sector as unimportant without really realising just how important it really is to us in our day-to-day. And the funding regimes, with the tiny and reducing amounts of funding for culture, makes that particularly difficult, and that in turn impacts on the artist's creativity, autonomy, freedom, all of those words. So I think I'll stop there, and happy to take any questions later.
Thank you very much, Sarah. You opened up our minds and by giving this international European perspective, and a lot of the things you said we recognize as well in the Belgian context. And I think you also waved the path for the panel discussion after the coffee break, I think. And one of the things that also, really, how should I say that I really will remember, and it's also referring to the introduction of our Dean, is that in a society that is evolving, we can't take it for granted. Maybe we, in Europe, we took artistic autonomy, it's not new, and we take it maybe too much for granted because it's there in different dimensions and with different faces, and I think your last slide also, how to respond to it, I think that's really food for thoughts. So let's have a coffee break now, and sorry there was no coffee at the beginning, but you can catch up now with some also some snacks, so I hope everybody will be happy, and we come back after the break for the panel discussion. Thank you very much.